That ain't hunger, that's famine. You better check twice, he's pretty dirty.
The Wild West, known for its rugged landscapes and daring adventures, is often seen as a thrilling time in American history. But behind the stories of outlaws and frontier life, daily living was far from glamorous. Unlike today, where cleanliness is easily attainable, the pioneers of the Wild West faced a tough existence, struggling to maintain hygiene in a dusty, untamed world. With few of the comforts we now take for granted, then was a constant battle against dirt and disease. Join us as we uncover the dirty habits of the Old West. Number 15. Dirty streets. The streets of the Wild West weren't just paths, they were hazards. Across the western frontier, these streets were often filled with horse manure, discarded waste, and mud that could swallow your boots whole. Horse-drawn wagons were the main mode of transport, and their droppings were left to rot, adding to the stench that hung heavy in the air. Without any organized waste removal system, settlers often threw their garbage right onto the streets, where it would mix with the muck and create a breeding ground for disease. This was a reality for nearly every frontier town, and it wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The lawless nature of these towns added to the filth, with regular brawls spilling out of saloons. Blood and sometimes bodies would be left in the streets. After notorious events like the gunfight at the OK Corral, it wasn't unusual for dead bodies to remain on the streets until someone had the task of moving them. The streets became a grim reminder of the violence that was an everyday occurrence in these wild towns. Beyond the visible mess, the smell was something else entirely. Without proper sewage systems, human waste often ended up in the streets. People used outhouses when they could, but many simply dumped their waste directly into the road. The result was a stench so strong that visitors often remarked on it. One traveler described the smell in Deadwood as a hellish stench caused by the mix of human and animal waste. This kind of filth made outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid fever common. These diseases thrived in the unsanitary conditions, turning what might have been a minor illness in a cleaner environment into a deadly epidemic in these filthy towns. Efforts to clean up were minimal at best. Some towns tried to enforce ordinances requiring residents to clean the area in front of their homes, but without any real enforcement, these laws were mostly ignored. It wasn't until much later that larger cities started to develop more structured waste removal systems. But by then, the damage was done, and the streets of the Wild West had already earned their dirty reputation. Number 14. Infested beds. In the Wild West, many beds were not the comfortable, plush pieces of furniture we know today. The most common bed was a simple wooden frame, often crudely constructed, with a mattress filled with straw, hay, or feathers. These materials provided some comfort, but were also perfect breeding grounds for all sorts of pests. The straw mattresses in particular were notorious for attracting bedbugs, lice, and fleas. These tiny creatures could easily burrow into the straw, making the beds a nightmare to sleep in. The wooden bed frames themselves were often rough and unfinished, with cracks and crevices that became the perfect hiding spots for bedbugs. These pests would emerge at night, feeding on the blood of the unfortunate sleepers, leaving behind itchy bites and making rest nearly impossible. The problem was worsened by the fact that these beds were rarely cleaned. In many cases, the bedding wasn't washed for weeks or even months, allowing the infestations to grow unchecked. In boarding houses, inns, and saloons, where travelers frequently stayed, the situation was even worse. These beds were often shared by multiple people over time, each potentially bringing new pests with them. The constant turnover of guests meant that bed bugs and lice could spread rapidly from one person to another, turning these beds into veritable hives of infestation. The straw-filled mattresses, already prone to pests, would become even more uncomfortable as the infestations grew, with the straw breaking down and compacting over time, offering less support and more places for bugs to hide. Some settlers tried to combat these infestations using various methods. They might attempt to smoke out the pests by burning sulfur or herbs near the bed, or they might try to clean the beds with harsh lye soap if water was available. However, these efforts were rarely successful. Without modern cleaning supplies or effective pesticides, most people simply had to endure the bites and discomfort night after night. In some cases, entire mattresses would need to be burned and replaced. but this was a costly and time-consuming process that many couldn't afford. Number 13. Outhouses. Using an outhouse in the Wild West was far from a pleasant experience. These primitive structures, often nothing more than a small wooden shack with a hole dug beneath, were a necessary evil for many pioneers. In the late 1800s, indoor plumbing was a rare luxury, so outhouses became the go-to solution for answering nature's call. The typical outhouse was a small, cramped structure, usually located a fair distance from the main living quarters to keep the unpleasant odors at bay. These buildings were constructed from whatever materials were available, often rough-hewn wood that did little to protect users from the elements. The floors were usually dirt, and the seats were simply holes cut into wooden planks. Outhouses were built over a pit that could be anywhere from a few feet to several feet deep. The waste would accumulate in this pit until it was either full or unbearable, at which point it would need to be emptied, a job nobody wanted. Emptying an outhouse was a foul task, often done by digging a new hole nearby and moving the entire structure over it, leaving the old pit to slowly decompose. Some pioneers opted to fill the pit with dirt and abandon the site altogether, letting nature take care of the rest. Privacy in these outhouses was minimal. Many had crescent moon or star-shaped cutouts on the doors, which provided a bit of light and ventilation, but also made it clear when the outhouse was occupied. These small details, often romanticized in modern depictions, were born out of necessity rather than any aesthetic consideration. The crescent moon, for example, was a symbol for women, while a star often indicated that the outhouse was for men. However, using an outhouse wasn't just uncomfortable, it was also dangerous. The pit beneath the structure was a breeding ground for disease, attracting flies and other pests that could easily spread bacteria. In fact, outhouses were often a contributing factor to outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid fever, which thrived in such unsanitary conditions. The odor alone was enough to make many people sick, but the real danger lay in the unseen pathogens that lurked within. During the harsh winters, using an outhouse became an even greater ordeal. With temperatures dropping below freezing, the wooden structures offered little protection from the cold. Yet, despite the discomfort, people had no choice but to brave the elements. In some cases, chamber pots were used indoors during the coldest months to avoid a freezing trip to the outhouse, but this solution came with its own set of problems, including the challenge of emptying the pot later. The design of outhouses varied depending on the region and the resources available. In some areas, more affluent settlers might have built slightly larger and more robust structures, while others made do with whatever they could scavenge. But no matter how well built, the fact remained that outhouses were far from hygienic. Number 12. No toilet paper. In the Wild West, the lack of toilet paper was a daily challenge that settlers had to navigate with creativity and resilience. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't become widely available until the late 1800s, and even then, it was a luxury that many on the frontier couldn't afford or access. So, what did people use instead? The answer lies in the rough and ready nature of life on the frontier. One of the most common alternatives was corn cobs. Yes, the same corn cobs that were harvested for food served a dual purpose. Once the kernels were removed, the cob was surprisingly effective for cleaning up after using the outhouse. It was rough and certainly not comfortable, but it was readily available, making it a popular choice among settlers. Another widespread option was pages from old catalogs, newspapers, or even books. The Sears Roebuck catalog, first published in 1888, became a staple in many outhouses, not just for shopping, but for hygiene. The glossy pages were often torn out and used in place of toilet paper. This might seem like a strange choice today, but in a time when resources were scarce, anything that could be repurposed was valuable. Leaves were also used, with settlers choosing the broad leaves of plants like mullein. Known for its soft, fuzzy texture, mullein was often called cowboy toilet paper. However, not all leaves were created equal, and the wrong choice could lead to some painful and itchy consequences, especially with plants like poison ivy. For those living near water sources, moss was another alternative. It was soft and absorbent, making it a more comfortable option. However, moss wasn't always available, especially in the drier regions of the West. In more desperate situations, settlers might even use their own clothing rags, which would then be washed and reused. Number 11. Dental horrors. Dental care in the Wild West was more of a horror story than a healthcare practice. With a lack of modern dental tools and knowledge, keeping your teeth in decent shape was a challenge that most pioneers simply couldn't meet. The idea of brushing your teeth daily was far from common. Without access to toothbrushes or toothpaste, settlers had to rely on rudimentary methods to care for their teeth, or, more often than not, neglect them entirely. In the Wild West, people often used a rag dipped in salt or baking soda to scrub their teeth. Baking soda, while abrasive, was somewhat effective at removing surface stains, but it did little to prevent the buildup of plaque or treat cavities. Salt, on the other hand, was more commonly used for its antiseptic properties. People would mix it with water to create a mouthwash, hoping it would prevent infections. However, these methods were far from perfect, and most people's teeth suffered greatly. Toothbrushes, when available, were often handmade, with bristles made from animal hair. These were rare and typically only found in the homes of the wealthier settlers. The majority of people didn't have access to them and had to make do with what they could find. Some settlers used chewed sticks, similar to what was used in ancient times to clean their teeth. These sticks, often from trees like birch or willow, were frayed at one end to create a makeshift brush. When it came to dental emergencies, the options were grim. Toothaches were common, given the lack of proper dental hygiene, and they were often treated with whiskey or herbal remedies to numb the pain. But if the pain became unbearable, there was only one real solution: extraction. Dental extraction in the Wild West was a brutal affair. Barbers often doubled as dentists, and their tools were crude at best. The process was painful, with no anesthesia available. The unfortunate patient would often be given a stiff drink of whiskey and then have the tooth yanked out with pliers or other makeshift tools. Records from the time show that many people feared these extractions so much that they would endure the pain of a rotten tooth for as long as possible before finally giving in. There were some attempts at more advanced dental care. For instance, some towns had traveling dentists who would visit periodically, bringing slightly better tools and knowledge with them. These dentists could perform more complex procedures, like drilling and filling cavities, but their visits were rare and their services were expensive. Most settlers couldn't afford such luxuries, leaving them to suffer in silence or resort to the harsh methods available locally. The poor state of dental care in the Wild West contributed to a host of other health issues. Infections from untreated cavities could spread, leading to severe complications or even death in extreme cases. Number 10. Spitting. Spitting was such a widespread and nasty habit in the Wild West that it became a serious public health issue. By the late 1800s, the constant spitting of tobacco juice had turned many public spaces into filthy, hazardous areas. Men, especially those who chewed tobacco, would spit on the floors of saloons, streets, and even inside public buildings. This habit wasn't just unhygienic, it was dangerous. The spit would mix with dust and sawdust on the floors, creating a sticky, bacteria-laden mess that contributed to the spread of diseases like tuberculosis. In many frontier towns, the problem became so severe that laws were enacted to curb the practice. By the 1890s, cities across the West, including places like Dodge City and Tombstone, started imposing fines on those caught spitting in public places. In 1896, for instance, the city of San Francisco introduced a strict ordinance that fined anyone caught spitting on the sidewalks. The fines could range from 25 cents to $5, which was a significant amount at the time. This was a desperate attempt to combat the spread of tuberculosis, a deadly disease that was rampant in these unsanitary conditions. The enforcement of these laws was taken seriously. In some towns, violators were not only fined, but also jailed for repeated offenses. Lawmen like Wyatt Earp, who were famous for maintaining order in places like Tombstone, were often tasked with enforcing these anti-spitting laws. However, despite these efforts, the habit was so deeply ingrained in the culture that it took years for these laws to have a noticeable impact. Spittoons, brass containers designed to catch spit, became a common sight in saloons and other public places. While these helped to some extent, they were far from a perfect solution. The spittoons themselves were often dirty and rarely emptied, making them just as much a part of the problem as the solution. In many cases, the floors around these spittoons would be stained with the overflow of tobacco juice, creating a lingering odor that only added to the unsanitary conditions of the time. Number 9. Cowboy smell. Cowboys were known for many things: their ruggedness, their bravery, and yes, their smell. After days, sometimes weeks, on the trail, a cowboy's scent was anything but fresh. The combination of sweat, dust, campfire smoke, and cattle made for a potent mix that was hard to ignore. Bathing opportunities were few and far between on cattle drives, which often lasted months. Cowboys might only bathe when they reached a river or stream, which wasn't always possible. As a result, they often went days without changing clothes, or even rinsing off the sweat and grime that accumulated from hard labor under the hot sun. Their clothes, especially their leather chaps and woolen shirts, absorbed and held onto odors. Leather gear, in particular, would become soaked with sweat, creating a strong, musky smell that only intensified over time. To mask the smell, some cowboys would rub sagebrush on their bodies or clothes, but this was more of a temporary fix than a real solution. Even the food they ate contributed to their odor. A diet heavy in beans, beef, and coffee didn't exactly promote fresh breath. Combined with the lack of regular bathing, this created a strong, lingering scent that was unmistakable. Number 8. Contaminated water sources. In the Wild West, water was as valuable as gold, but it often came with a hidden danger: contamination. Drinking from contaminated water sources was a common and deadly problem that many settlers and pioneers faced. Streams, rivers, and wells that seemed fresh were frequently polluted by animal waste, human activity, or natural minerals that made the water unsafe to drink. One of the most notorious examples of water contamination came from cattle drives. Thousands of cattle would trample through streams and rivers, leaving behind waste that seeped into the water. This pollution turned what seemed like a refreshing source into a breeding ground for diseases like dysentery and cholera. In some towns, entire communities were wiped out by outbreaks stemming from their contaminated water sources. Even the wells, which were thought to be safer, weren't immune to contamination. Poorly dug wells could be too shallow, allowing surface pollutants to seep in. If the well was close to an outhouse or a livestock pen, the risk was even higher. There are accounts of settlers falling ill after drinking what they thought was clean water, only to discover too late that their well had been compromised. In mining towns, the problem was compounded by the chemicals used in mining operations. Mercury and arsenic, commonly used in gold extraction, often leaked into nearby rivers and streams. This not only poisoned the water, but also had long-term effects on the health of those who relied on these sources for their daily needs. Number 7. Bathing practices. Bathing in the Wild West was anything but luxurious. With water being a scarce and precious resource, taking a bath was often a rare and laborious event. In the 1800s, most settlers and cowboys didn't have the convenience of running water, and bathing practices reflected the harsh realities of frontier life. To start, the process of bathing required gathering enough water, which was no small feat. Water had to be hauled from the nearest river, creek, or well, and then heated over an open fire. This was time-consuming and labor-intensive, so most people didn't bathe frequently. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a person to go weeks or even months without a full bath. They often relied on a quick rinse of the face and hands to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. When a bath was taken, it was often in a small metal tub, and the same water might be used by multiple family members, one after the other. By the time the last person got in, the water was murky and far from refreshing. This shared bathwater practice was a necessity in households where water was too precious to waste, but it wasn't the most sanitary option. Public bathhouses became popular in larger towns by the late 1800s. For a small fee, one could enjoy a soak in a tub of hot water, likely the cleanest bath they would have all year. These bathhouses were particularly common in places like San Francisco, where they catered to miners and other laborers who could afford the luxury. However, these facilities were still rare, and most settlers had to make do with their own makeshift setups. Number 6. Wild hair care. In the Wild West, taking care of your hair was a tough task, just like everything else on the frontier. With limited access to clean water and hygiene products, maintaining a healthy hair was no small feat. Men and women alike had to rely on whatever resources they could find, often turning to improvised solutions that reflected the rugged environment they lived in. For many, the daily battle began with simple tools, combs made from animal bones or wood. These combs were used to detangle hair and, more importantly, to remove lice, a constant nuisance in the dusty and dirty conditions of the frontier. Lice were so common that some people resorted to shaving their heads completely to avoid infestations, especially during summer. Washing hair was a luxury. In towns where water was scarce, people washed their hair infrequently, often waiting weeks between washes. When they did, they used homemade soaps crafted from animal fat and lye, which could be harsh on both skin and hair. This soap, though effective at removing dirt and grease, often left hair dry and brittle. To combat this, some settlers used whiskey or natural oils like castor oil or bear grease, applying it to their hair to keep it somewhat manageable. Women in particular faced challenges in maintaining their long hair. They would often braid their hair tightly to keep it clean for longer periods and reduce the need for frequent washing. To add shine and mask odors, some women used lavender water or other herbal infusions, though these were considered luxuries. Despite the rough conditions, hair care was still an essential part of life in the Wild West. It was a way for settlers to maintain a semblance of normalcy and dignity amidst the harsh realities of frontier living. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. Picture this. A rugged cowboy strides into a saloon, the doors swinging behind him as his boots thud against the wooden floor. But as he approaches the bar, people beside him can't help but recoil. The pungent aroma that announces him isn't just the smell of the open plains. It's days, perhaps weeks, of sweat, dust, and the unmistakable scent of a life spent in the saddle with no time for baths. This isn't just a personal failing, but a vivid snapshot of the hygiene horrors that plagued the Wild West. In a world where water was gold and baths were a rare luxury, the cowboy's stench was as common as the gunfights that made these saloons infamous. Could you imagine standing next to him, drink in hand, trying to ignore the stench? What do you think about the hygiene horrors of the Wild West? Let us know in the comments section below. Number 5. Laundry. Doing laundry in the Wild West was a challenge unlike anything we experience today. For settlers, the process was exhausting and often took an entire day to complete. The lack of modern conveniences meant that every step, from collecting water to drying clothes, had to be done manually, making laundry one of the most dreaded tasks on the frontier. Water was the most crucial element, and it wasn't always easy to come by. Settlers had to collect water from wells, rivers, or streams, and then haul it back to their homes. This water was often muddy or filled with debris, which didn't make washing clothes any easier. In places where water was especially scarce, laundry was done infrequently, sometimes only once a month. The washing process began by heating the collected water over an open fire. This was done in large iron pots, where the water would be brought to a boil. Soap, usually homemade from animal fat and lye, was added to the boiling water. This soap was harsh and could cause irritation to the skin, but it was necessary to cut through the dirt and grime that clung to clothing after weeks of wear. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards, a tool that became essential for frontier families. These boards, made of wood or metal, were used to scrape and scrub each garment. The repetitive motion was hard on the hands, and many women found their skin cracking and bleeding by the end of laundry day. The task was made even more difficult by the heavy materials used in frontier clothing, such as denim and wool, which were durable but challenging to clean. Drying could take hours, and in colder months, it could take days. The dry, dusty climate of the West often left clothes feeling stiff and rough. This was just another discomfort that settlers had to endure. Chinese immigrants were pivotal to the laundry business in the Wild West, particularly in boom towns and mining camps. They often set up small, makeshift laundries, where they washed clothes for miners, cowboys, and other laborers who couldn't afford to take a day off for laundry. Number 4. Communal towels. In the Wild West, hygiene was often a matter of convenience over cleanliness, and one of the most unsettling practices was the use of communal towels. Imagine stepping out of a bath only to dry off with the same towel used by every other person before you. That was the reality for many living on the frontier. Communal towels were a common sight in saloons, boarding houses, and even in some private homes. These towels would hang on a rack or nail, becoming increasingly grimy as the day went on. Arizona historian Marshall Trimble explains in True West magazine that they would eat from the same plate, drink from the same cup, and then share the same towel to wipe the beer from their mustache at the bar. With water scarce and laundry a labor-intensive task, towels were not washed as frequently as they should have been. As a result, they became breeding grounds for bacteria, spreading everything from common colds to more serious infections. In some places, these towels were used until they were practically unusable, only then being replaced. Number 3. Sawdust in saloons. Step into a saloon in the Wild West, and you'd be greeted by more than just the smell of whiskey and tobacco. The floors were often covered in sawdust, a curious choice, but one with practical purposes. Sawdust was scattered across the floors of these rowdy establishments to soak up spilled drinks, blood, and other less savory messes that accumulated throughout the day. Saloon floors were the epicenter of Wild West life. Cowboys, miners, and outlaws alike gathered here to drink, gamble, and sometimes settle scores. With so much activity, spills and fights were common. The sawdust helped absorb the liquid messes and provided some traction on the otherwise slick wooden floors. However, this sawdust also harbored bacteria and dirt, making the saloons far from clean. The sawdust wasn't changed regularly either. In many saloons, it would be left on the floor for days, soaking up more and more filth. As a result, the floors became breeding grounds for germs. Patrons would track in dirt from the dusty streets, adding to the unsanitary conditions. The mixture of sawdust, dirt, and bodily fluids created a thick layer of grime that was nearly impossible to clean. Number 2. Troubles down below. From 1837 to 1901, taking care of personal hygiene was not straightforward. Women in particular struggled a lot. Their dresses had many layers which made it difficult to go to the restroom. Rose Heichelbeck from Great Life Publishing's Dusty Old Thing pointed out that women in the Old West wore special pantaloons without a crotch, making it easier for them to use the toilet by just hovering over it. According to the BBC's Laurel Ives, women used to douche regularly to avoid unpleasant smells and discomfort. Before sanitary pads were invented in 1888, women used natural materials like grass, cotton, rabbit fur, rags, or sheep's wool during their periods. Rainey Horowitz from Arizona State University mentions that tampons weren't available until 1931. Men also had their own concerns about keeping clean down there. By 1894, men were scared into using treatments advertised by dubious doctors like Dr. Otterberg from Salt Lake City, who promised cures for various problems. Kate Ringer at the University of Idaho explains that many doctors believed circumcision was the best way to keep men's genitals clean and free from diseases. It was even wrongly thought that circumcision could prevent or cure problems like epilepsy, mental challenges, masturbation, and syphilis. Doctors also claimed it could even cure hysteria in women. Number 1. The Wild West was dusty. The Wild West was a dusty place, and that dust was everywhere. The dry environment combined with the relentless wind meant that dust was a daily part of life. It coated clothes, skin, and even the inside of homes, making cleanliness a nearly impossible goal. Cowboys on cattle drives were especially familiar with this problem. As they moved vast herds across the plains, the cattle would kick up huge amounts of dust. This dust would stick to the cowboys, covering them from head to toe. In frontier towns, the situation wasn't much better. Streets were unpaved, so every footstep or passing wagon stirred up clouds of dust. This dust would blow into homes and businesses, settling on every surface. Cleaning was a constant task, but even with daily sweeping, it was impossible to keep the dust at bay. It found its way into food, water, and beds, making life on the frontier a dusty ordeal. The relentless dust of the Wild West wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a health hazard. Breathing in dust day after day led to respiratory problems, known at the time as dust lung. Settlers and cowboys alike suffered from chronic coughing and other ailments, all worsened by the ever-present dust. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.